assuming your Office 365 data is automatically backed up can feel a lot like this.
And once again, ladies and gentlemen,
Backing up Office 365 data with Veeam feels like this. So back it up with Veeam.
Hello, welcome to my talk, Build Your First SharePoint Client-Side Web Part with the SharePoint Framework. My name is David Patrick, and this is the Omaha 365 Conference Virtual Edition. So, who am I? Again, my name is Dave Patrick. I'm a Microsoft Certified Trainer, a Microsoft Certified Solution Developer, Microsoft Certified Solutions Expert. I basically have a lot of exams under my belt. I've been working with SharePoint since 2001, since when it was in beta. Anyone remember the beta name for it was Tahoe? I've got one certification that I'm kind of proud of. It's the MCP DED, which is really funny because it stands for Microsoft Certified Professional Developer, Enterprise Application Developer. But I'm quite certain that somebody at Microsoft saw the exams I were taking and they thought, let's make up a funny one for this guy that he qualifies for. I work for the Army. I'm a IT customer lead, trainer, SharePoint developer, SharePoint administrator. My official title is SME, subject matter expert. I work for, my customer is the U.S. Army, but I work for a company called DSA, and we have all sorts of DoD customers, and we have locations all across the United States, including Hawaii. So if anyone's interested in a job, shoot me an email. You can reach me at davidpatrick@madsharepoint.com, which, by the way, I also run a user group called Mad SharePoint. Quick plug for my company. They've been around since 1963. They do not just SharePoint, not only collaboration and knowledge management, but also cybersecurity, identity management, network engineering, systems engineering, technical assistance. They do it all. I've been working for them for almost 9 years now. I thought I'd be there 6 months. It's really a great company to work for. If anyone's interested, again, shoot me an email. I'd love to give you more information. So my group, one of my main, I actually run 3 user groups, but one of my main one is called Mad SharePoint, and you can find us at www.madsharepoint.com. And we have gone virtual. We actually went virtual a couple of years ago. When I say virtual, it was actually hybrid. So we still did face-to-face, but we would also put our meetups using Microsoft Teams. You could log in and attend either virtually or in person. Thanks to the current conditions, we've been all virtual. So feel free to check us out and join us virtually for our next meetup. What are some of the session objectives? What are the takeaways? I like to keep it real simple. There's 3 things I want you guys to take away from this talk. I think there'll be more, but these are the 3 main ones. I want you to know what a web part is in Visual Studio or in SharePoint. I want you to know how to build one and how to deploy one, how to get it out there in the real world. And that's what we're going to cover. We're going to cover a few other things, but those are the 3 main takeaways I want you to leave with. So for those of you who don't know, hopefully everyone does, but every now and then I get some folks that are kind of brand new to SharePoint. SharePoint has a lot of capabilities, right? And back in the day, this is a graphic that was popular around the 2010 timeframe. Microsoft liked to talk about the circle of SharePoint capabilities. You had sites, you had communities, you could do content management, there was search capabilities, there was business intelligence or insights, and then there was this idea of composite applications. That's the low code, no code, where people, citizen developers could develop solutions in SharePoint without having to write, compilable code. All that still exists there, even in SharePoint Online. But the reason I mention this is that there's just so much out there. SharePoint, there's so many different things that you can build and different ways you can extend it and different ways you can dive into it and it's like a Swiss Army knife. So it does get difficult. I actually, where I work, I have about 20 developers that I support. And they're constantly asking me questions like, well, how do I do this? How do I do it? What's the best way? What should I learn? And there's no, one right answer. So there's a lot of different ways that you can grab a hold of SharePoint and do things with it. And we're going to talk about one of those today, which is web parts. If you're a developer and you start looking into SharePoint, and I started out as a .NET developer, and then I kind of moved into the SharePoint world, you'll see that there's a lot of different productivity tools out there. There's different ways that you can extend it. There's you can do different kinds of data access. There's different kinds of LOB or lines of business integration you can do. Different ways to do workflows. Different ways you can deploy your applications. So this just kind of covers that. Again, it's a little overwhelming, to be honest, as my new developers are getting used to doing things in SharePoint. They're always with this, where do I start? And I'm hoping with this talk today we can give you one solid way, soup to nuts. Okay, I can do a web part. This is how what a web part is, and this is how I do one. This is how I get it out there, and that'll give you some. At least you'll have one tool in your tool belt in your SharePoint customization and extension tool belt. It's a vast landscape. You can build collaboration applications. You can build off of the .NET ASP.NET, which is at the core of SharePoint. You can integrate with other Microsoft Dynamics, other line of business application data. You can do your own customized. You can build things on the server. Now that's, as we've moved to the cloud, that's kind of the old way of doing things. And in fact, if you're working on the cloud, you're not doing server workloads anymore. But in the old days, in 2013 and prior to that, when we were on premises, we spent a lot of time learning how to build customized server workloads. Then there's all these data technologies that you have to learn. So there's REST APIs and client object model and the data platform from the farm, the site, the list data, the external list, the server object model. There was something called LINQ that we used to learn, language integrated query, where it was kind of like SQL for SharePoint lists, and you could use that to make querying lists a little bit easier. So my developers, as they're researching SharePoint and they see all this, they kind of get overwhelmed. And then I kind of say, well, that's all well and good, but then there's also HTML5, CSS, JavaScript, jQuery, SP services. There's a lot of other client-side tools. And again, these tools become even more important as you look towards building applications that are cloud-friendly, or if you're in SharePoint Online, that will run easily in the cloud. These help us to write client-side applications that are not living on the server. So these become really important. And Microsoft realized that after around 2013, they said to themselves, you know what, we're going to actually formalize this. We're going to allow you to build an app which utilizes these client-side technologies and you can kind of compile them, or maybe that's not the right word, but build them into a package and deploy them to SharePoint. And that was good for a little while, but we had some issues with that. So not the least of which is the fact that they renamed them to add-ins. So now you had apps and add-ins that are slightly different. We still, they weren't perfect. You still had some authentication issues with that. So finally, Microsoft said, you know what? We started out in 2007, and you could do deployment to the server, and there's some issues with that. Then in 2010, we introduced a sandbox to try to encapsulate and try to abstract some things and kind of provide some safety around things that people were running. And then that thing, I had issues. So in 2013, we came up with this idea of an app/add-in, and that also kind of, helped to move things off of the server, but also had still, some issues that we had to work at. So finally, 2016, Feature Pack 2, we now have the SharePoint Framework, which is made for 2016, 2019, and SharePoint Online. And the framework takes everything that, all the lessons learned up until now, and provides us with a platform that has a lot of benefits. And we're going to talk about what some of those benefits are. What are some of the pros of the SharePoint Framework? Well, it runs as the current user, so we don't have to muck around with the like we did with add-ins, with trying to do an authentication, getting a token and all that other stuff. It uses the normal document object model, so that's really nice. It's nothing fancy there, nothing new to learn. If you're already doing web development, then you're familiar with manipulating the document object model using JavaScript and jQuery libraries and JavaScript libraries and things like that. By default, it's naturally responsive, naturally accessible. So using the SharePoint Framework, it's going to be very easy to take your page and make it look good on a mobile device. It's going to be very easy if you have 508 compliance, where someone's colorblind, or they're blind and they need a screen reader. You can make it's easier to make your program accessible and 508 compliant. Has access to all the event life cycles, so load, unload, all that good stuff is still there. It's not officially tied to a specific framework, so when you build a web part using the SharePoint Framework, you can choose to use other JavaScript frameworks such as React, Angular, Knockout, all those guys. It's your choice. The common tools that we use to build web parts in the SharePoint Framework are things that are already open source and may be familiar to you, like NPM, TypeScript, Yeoman, Webpack, Gulp, They've already been out there. They're open source, and they're not too difficult to pick up and start using. That said, let's talk about some of the cons of the SharePoint framework. And a lot of these, you might notice if I flip back here, are the same as the pros. So it's just kind of taking a different perspective. Runs as a current user, so it's difficult to do things like impersonate a user. If you were a fan of the old 2013 workflows, it was an impersonation step where you could do things that the user couldn't do by impersonating the user. So that's one. While it's good, it's also could be considered a con. Uses the normal DOM. Again, there's restrictions to using the document object model, like writing out to the C drive or something like that. So those are all still impressed upon us when we're using the SharePoint framework. Not officially tied to a specific framework. I said that was a good thing earlier, but that can also be a bad thing. So what if you wanted native support for React or Angular or Knockout? You're not going to get it. It's because they chose to be give you that flexibility. The flip side is then you have you're responsible for adding that in, and it does. I say that, but you'll see when we go and generate our web part later, there is some support for some of this to create the templates and create that support, but not all of them. So because they're trying not to tie to a specific framework, there's not. I don't think there's a knockout template for us. So if we want to do that, you can do it, but the work's on you. The fact that the tools are common open source, I put that as a positive. It can also be a negative if, like me, you grew up on the proprietary Microsoft development stack, right? I used to use, and we'll see here in a second, Visual Studio and .NET Framework and all that stuff. So what does this mean? If you're going to go with the SharePoint framework, you're going to have to learn all new stuff. Almost. There's some stuff that can be reused, like REST and things like that. But for the most part, there's a lot of new stuff to learn. So you might remember we used to have SharePoint Designer. It was our no-code tool for SharePoint, and we could do all sorts of cool things with that. That's out the window. No more. There's no Designer for 2016, 2019. Certainly not for SharePoint Online. No new version, I should say. And when we're talking about SharePoint Framework, SharePoint Designer, it doesn't really come into play. What about Visual Studio? I mentioned that 2 seconds ago. Visual Studio, my old friend. 2019, 2017, 2013, all the old versions. They were the way I would build solutions, not just in SharePoint, but all sorts of solutions. I had my familiar, friendly GUI designer, the web part designer there, and the different project types I would choose from. Nope, gone. SharePoint Framework comes up with a sort of a lean, mean. We use Visual Studio Code or any of your favorite text editors. I guess you could use Notepad++ or something like that. And you use, command line utilities that are open source. So, not goodbye, but at least for the SharePoint framework, we won't be using Visual Studio. So what we'll be using? So as I mentioned, we got these new tools, and I kind of tried to line them up to give you an idea of which ones are replacing which. So you've got on the bottom, that's our old tools, the .NET Framework, NuGet, C#, Visual Studio, MS Build. And on top, the open source tools when we're doing SharePoint Framework stuff that replace them. So things like Node.js, which replaces our .NET Framework, NPM, which replaces NuGet, TypeScript, which replaces C#, Visual Studio Code, which replaces Visual Studio, and then Gulp and Webpack that replace MS Build. So there is a whole new set of tools that you have to start learning, you have to install, you have to become familiar with. And it is a bit challenging and a little daunting at first when you see all this and you're like, oh my gosh, I got really good at the old way of doing things, and now it's a whole new way of doing things. Whole new world, as Ariel would say from Disney. What about the environment that you're working on? So in the old days, we were told we could do SharePoint development on Windows 7. You could even do it back on Vista. SP1, I'm really showing my age here. Then we found that doing development on a physical machine was just too much trouble. You were constantly patching and messing up your machine. So we switched to using virtual machines, and that made things much better. And then when Azure got really popular, and I got my MSDN subscription, and I had credits I could use, I moved my virtual machines to the cloud. So now, whenever I'm doing SharePoint development, even if I'm doing old school SharePoint development, I'm typically using a development machine that's hosted in a virtual machine in Azure. So if you're unfamiliar with Azure, I do have a whole nother talk there. I go into lots of great detail of how to get started using Azure for SharePoint developers. But in a nutshell, portal.azure.com, it allows you to create a development environment for SharePoint, whether it's a single virtual machine or a whole farm. You can do a 3-server farm, a 6-server farm. You can do multiple farms. In my some of my other talks where I talk about Azure for SharePoint developers, I actually go through setting up a 4-server farm that does 2013, 2016, 2019 all simultaneously. So it's really cool. There's really a lot of potential for using Azure to create SharePoint development environments. I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention some other opportunities for using virtual environments to do development in SharePoint. And one that is out there is a capability to use Docker in SharePoint Framework development. And there's a great little video, and I've got a link embedded in the slides if you want to check it out later, that introduces you to Docker and shows you how you can use Docker. They're not actually virtual machines, but they're kind of like mini virtual machines, and you can use them. You can configure them for different versions that you want to target in SharePoint Framework and use them like virtual machines. You can even host them in Azure if you want, or you can run them locally like you did, sort of like some of the old virtual machines that you would run on premises. So another alternate way of saying, hey, if I want to do development, but I don't want to tie to my main machine, you can use Docker, and that gives you the choice to either do it on premises or in the cloud. All right, so this whole talk came about as I was reading the documentation, and there's a great little 4-step tutorial on how to build your Hello World web part. And as I was going through it, I thought, well, hey, this is a quick, 15-minute tutorial I'll run through. And I found out, no, it actually takes a bit longer to get up and running from soup to nuts. So that's why I thought, hey, let's go over this with folks and kind of walk them through everything I needed to do to get through this tutorial. So we'll talk about it. And again, the link's here in the slides if anyone wants to bring up the documentation and check it out yourself. But what we're going to do is we're going to go through the 4 steps, building the Hello Web part. We're also going to touch on what we had to do to get started as far as firing up our virtual machine, configuring it with all the tools, configuring Office 365 development tenant, and tying them all together. So the first step was setting up my environment. And I said, you know what? I need to choose how I'm going to do this. Am I going to do this on Windows? Am I going to use Linux or Mac? There's support for all of that, but I'm going to stick with Windows. I'm a Windows guy. And then I had the second sub-choice I had to make was, what am I going to do? Am I going to do a virtual machine? Am I going to use Docker? Am I going to use my physical machine? For me, it's a no-brainer. I've been using virtual machines for this kind of thing. Do it in Azure. I've got all this Azure credit that my company allots me. So, and if you're new to Azure, you can sign up and get a $200 credit for like 30 days to play with this. There's also, if you're a student, there's ways to sign up for Azure and get some credit to play around with. But I'll use my MSDN subscription. It gives me $150 in credit every month, and that works just fine. Once I set up my virtual machine, once I create my virtual machine, I can then install all the requirements: Node.js, Yeoman Gulp, Yeoman SharePoint Generator, and then there's this step to trust the self-signed developer search. So let's walk through all that. So let's jump out here to my virtual machine, and I'll show you how I got there. I basically just went out to Azure, as I mentioned, portal.azure.com. And it says I've got some free recommendations. We're not going to do that. But then I went in and I created, and this particular identity doesn't have any subscriptions, but if you have a subscriptions, then you click, like I said, through your MSDN, your company, you can click on virtual machines and you can click add. And then once you add one, you can, pick Windows 2012 server, Windows 2016 server, and then you remote into that. And then in that server, you can install. I'm actually remoted into my machine right now, and you can see up here at the top that my machine is out there on the internet at this IP address. But let me actually reduce this and give you guys an idea what we're looking at. So here's my actual Azure that I used. Here's the list of all the resources that I have available, and this is the machine, the SharePoint Framework dev machine that I created. So literally, I just start it up when I'm ready to go. It's like Uber. When I start it, it starts using my credits. When I stop, it stops using my credits. I did a connect, and when I did a connect, it comes up with a little couple options. So I use remote desktop. I download that file. I open it up. I give it my username and password. And once I do that, it would actually connect me to that. This is my virtual machine down here. Then it connects me to my virtual machine. Inside here, I can do all sorts of things. I can set up Docker. I can install Visual Studio Code. In fact, what I did is I went through, and I'll show you what I set up. So the first thing, as we go through this article here, it says, hey, by the way, before you can build your web part, you got to set up your development environment. So I clicked on that, and then from there it said, hey, you need to set up an Office 365 tenant. So I did that, which is here. Let's do that. Before I actually created my app catalog, I needed to join the Office 365 developer program. That's important. Let me show you what that does. That is a free, for a developer, Office 365 5-user tenant that Microsoft will renew for you as long as you're using it. So I think they look every 60 or 90 days, and if it's in use, they just automatically renew it. I've had one for like 7 or 8 years now. So let's see, did this guy come up? Open this guy up here in a new window so we can see it. So this is it. This is the Office 365 developer program. Free to join, no credit card. You sign up, you say, hey, I want to build Office 365 solutions, SharePoint being the main one that I want to do. You can see, oh, look, my current one, I'm already in it, is inactive and will expire. Is this the right one? I'm using it now, so hopefully that'll automatically. Looks like I got 14 days left, but yeah, match. I'm sure this is going to renew because I'm using it. So even though this says it's inactive, we'll find out. It'll auto renew. I've had this one for years. All right. So once you sign up for that, then that will give you an Office 365 tenant. And if I go over here to one of my windows, I'll show you what that looks like. So literally I can come in here and type office.com. And if I hadn't already logged in, it would prompt me to log in with whatever credentials I set up during my sign up. And then I can click on SharePoint, and that's going to take me to my SharePoint Online that's part of that Office 365 developer tenant. And from there I can go to different sites, I can create new sites, anything I want to do. I actually have all of my developers sign up for this. I think they should all have their own developer tenant where they are global administrator. They can create site collections, they can create app catalogs, they can create team sites, communication sites, hub sites. They can test out all the new latest and greatest stuff, and it's not going to affect anything else because they're in their own little world. That's what this is really great for. So we'll come back to this in a minute. So the next thing we needed to do after we created our tenant is to set up our SharePoint development environment. So we did this already. We set it up, our tenant. And by the way, I'm glossing over some of these steps, but there's great little videos in the documentation. So if you want to, see some of the details, they will walk you through. Now, in this example, the next step for me is in my virtual machine, install Node.js, and I have done this already. I clicked on that link, and it came up with a list of different releases. And I'm kind of, again, I had to take a step back. I saw this. I'm like, geez, gosh, you think they could have made this a little simpler? Which one do I need? But, I need it. I want the 64-bit version. I'm running Windows, so I use the MSI, which is the Microsoft installer file. I could have done a zip file and ran the install myself, but I found this particular one worked really well for me. If I was doing 32-bit, I could have done x86, but I wanted to do 64. I do wish they made this, instead of just giving me a listing, it was a little more clear which one to choose. But so that's the first hurdle I had to deal with, is finding which version of Node I wanted. I downloaded that, and once I downloaded it, I ran it, and then it just came up and installed Node. There are some notes in the documentation. We'll go ahead. We're not going to let that that talk about, depending on what you're targeting, be careful. Certain versions of Node won't work. So I chose, I think it was Node 10, and that worked just fine. They mentioned something here, another note about, if you're using 2016, there's some additional details to worry about. The next step was to install a code editor. And I went with Visual Studio Code. I mean, I love it. Lightweight, great, familiar enough that if I, because I was already familiar with Visual Studio Code works just like a champ. So I downloaded it, installed that. It's a quick next. That's kind of what it looks like. This is the other download. I'm not going to run through the Node. I've already done that, but this is the Node.js setup. Cancel that. And now let me show you my Visual Studio. If you haven't seen this before, again, lightweight code editor, not much different than some of the other popular ones out there, like Notepad++. color coding, IntelliSense. It's just great. And it has a lot of extensions. I've used it to do Python programming, HTML, CSS, JavaScript programming, whatever you can imagine. So for these purposes, it's great. You can see all the color coding. This is one of the example hello worlds I was playing with earlier. This is the TypeScript file that gets compiled to JavaScript. And again, with the color coding and all that, it's really, really a great tool. So I highly recommend using Visual Studio Code if you're not really, have your heart set on any of the other ones. Okay, so code editor done. What else do we have to do? Yeoman and Gulp. So this is where it starts to get a little, if you're not familiar with the command line. Now, I grew up on the command line. I grew up using Microsoft DOS back in the day. But I know a lot of my students, I teach at the University of Maryland College Park, and they're much younger than me. And, when I say command line to them, they're like, wait, what? But this is a bunch of command line programs. So literally, you're jumping down to the command line and you're running nmp install gyo-gulp. So let's go ahead and try that. And even though I've done it already, I don't think it's going to hurt anything to do it again. So here's my command line. And let me not gloss over that. What did I do there? I clicked on my little start, CMD for command prompt. Bam, there we go. And then from there, I can just literally run these commands. So let's copy that first one, jump back over to my command line, paste that sucker in there, and now that's going to install Gulp for me. It takes a few minutes. And I have run it on different virtual machines or even physical machines where it's thrown errors. So usually you end up searching the internet for those errors and try to figure out maybe you've got something else installed that's conflicting with it, or maybe there's some prerequisite that you don't have installed. But I found that using a clean virtual machine in Azure usually results in the easiest and painless install of these utilities. So the last time I ran it ran through with no errors, so I was really excited about that. It's always fun when you do an install and there's no errors. So we'll let this run, think about it. These are all like that, right? So after that runs and successful, then you do the install of the SharePoint SharePoint generator. Again, just copying that command, switching over to the prompt, and rerunning, entering it into the command prompt. Looks like this one is, making sure everything is still good. Doing the reinstall from the first one. Let's just check and see. Is it almost done? That's still thinking. Oh, wait, yeah. Yeah, it's done. All right, so let's do the next one. So the next one was this guy. Copy that guy. Paste that in there. Similar type of operation. All right, we don't have to sit here and watch it throughout all the error all the progress messages. Make sure you've got a modern web browser, so Edge, Chrome, Firefox. IE11 is not going to work for some of the tools that are part of the framework, like the local workbench. So you definitely want to have Edge or Chrome or something like that. And then the final step, we won't do this at this moment, but sometime when we're working on our project, we want to make sure that we trust the cert. That's because when we're running our project, it's going to assume HTTPS, so we need to have some sort of cert to work with that. That's the encrypted hypertext transfer protocol. And so a self-signed cert will work just fine, and this will generate that for us. And those are the steps to get the main tool. Now, there's optional tools. I highly recommend Fiddler or Postman. Whenever you're doing REST calls, those are helpful. These tools are helpful to try to troubleshoot those. Some other tools are out there. Lots of good tools that you can work with. One of the tools that they don't list here because you don't have to install it's already installed is the F12 developer tool. So if you're using, in this case, I'm using Edge. It works almost the same in Chrome or in Firefox, but hitting F12 brings us up that developer console where you can look at the elements on the page, you can look for any console messages, you can do JavaScript debugging, you can look at the network and see what calls have been made to get this page to be rendered. So F12 developer tools, even they don't mention it here, is one of my most widely used tools. I'm constantly hitting F12 so I can figure out hey, what what network call failed, or why is this taking so long? What network call took the longest, or why is this element? What CSS is affecting this element? So if you're not familiar with the developer tools built into your browser, definitely spend some time because those are super valuable. So the next, in setting up our environment, I think that's it. Now we're ready to build our first client web part. So let's go ahead to switch to that part of the tutorial. And that says, all right, great. You've got your machine. You've installed all the open source tools. You've got your editor and everything. Let's build the web part. And again, there's a nice little video if you want to check that out. But we're going to walk through the steps. So the first step is to create a web part. Is some place to put our web part. So we're just going to create make directory md hello world web parts. Let's do that. And we will come over here to our, and I'm going to make a demo directory to put everything in. So I'm going to make directory demo, change directory demo, and then from here I can do that hello world web part. So now, and let's do a change directory. I'm using the up arrow so I don't have to type so much. There we go. So I made a directory called hello world web part, and I put it in a subdirectory called demo, and then I changed directory, so that's my current directory. And there's nothing in here at the moment. If I do a directory listing, it's empty. What's our next step? Now we want to, so we did the make directory, we did the change directory. Now we want to generate code, the template code for a SharePoint web part. So we're going to use the Yeoman SharePoint generator, that's what Yo is, and we're going to tell it to go ahead and create SharePoint solution, a Microsoft SharePoint solution. So we'll do that. This is equivalent if you're in Visual Studio, when you say file new project and you were to select visual web part, if you're doing a web part back in the 2013 days. It's just that in this one it's command line driven versus GUI driven. So okay, we've said we want to generate it. It's coming up and saying, what do you want to call your solution name? I'm going to stick with the defaults. Hello world web part sounds good to me. Then the next thing says is, what are you targeting? All right, and this is just going to control what the amount of code that it generates and what features are going to be available. So if I target SharePoint Online only, all the features are going to be available. If I go with 2016 onwards, including 2019, I'm going to have less features, right? Because 2016, 2019 don't support all the latest and greatest features. If I go with 2019, I'll have a little more features, but not quite as many as online, but at least more than just 2016. So we'll stick with, going up and down here, I'm going to stick with the latest, SharePoint Online only. Then it says, hey, where do you want to put everything? In the current folder. Yep, sounds good. I'm already in, I already created my subfolder, so I don't need to create a subfolder. And then what else is it going to ask me? It's going to ask me, bring this up so we can see this a little better. If I want to allow the tenant admin the choice of being able to deploy the solution to all sites immediately without running any feature deployment or adding apps in sites. So what is that's really, what do I want my flexibility to be? If I say yes, then the admin can choose to do it. If I say no, it's going to be automatic. Let's see what the tutorial tells us to do. They say no, right? All right, so we'll stick with what the tutorial says. So we'll say, I'm going to hit enter, and the capital N is the default anyway. So we'll say no to that. We're not going to give them the choice. We're just going to do it. And then down here, will the components in the solution require permissions to access APIs? This is a real simple one. We don't need it. We're going to accept the default. No to that one too. Finally, what type of client-side component are we creating? So I mentioned that we're going to do a web part. We could also do an extension. We could do a library. Different kinds of things, different ways we could extend SharePoint Online using SharePoint Framework, but we're going to stick with this one, which is just a web part. What's the name? We're going to accept the default, Hello World. Description, again, Hello World description sounds good. Do we need a framework? I mentioned that there is some support. I said that I don't think there was Knockout. There it is. There's Knockout. So React, Knockout. I knew one was missing. Angular is not there. Not that you can't use Angular. It's just not going to automatically generate the code for you to support that framework. But these two, it's part of the template. So if I wanted to do React or Knockout, it would generate that support. I'm going to keep it simple. I'm pretty sure that's what the solution says, to just go with no framework. Let's scroll down here and check the instructions. My wife always tells me to read the instructions, and pretty sure it says no framework. Yep, no framework. So come over here and we will say no framework. Now it's off to the races. It's generating all that code, some JSON files, some TypeScript files, some README files, config files, just like Visual Studio would do in the old days when you did it from a GUI standpoint. Now this command line is generating all that template code that we need to have a web part that we can customize. This does take a couple of minutes. I've timed it different times depending on how much memory you have available. What's the size of your machine, the speed of your disks. It's taken me 5 minutes. It's taken me 1 minute. I think the last time I did this on this machine, it took me a couple of minutes. So while that's thinking, we'll flip back over to our instructions and see what else we have to do. It's going to take a few minutes, and eventually it should say congratulations. And if we want to play with it, there's the command to play with it is called gulp serve. Now what that does is that starts a local web server that will serve up not only our web part, but a simulation of SharePoint. It's actually called the SharePoint Workbench, and it's the local workbench. There's actually two versions. There's the local workbench, and then the workbench is also available in SharePoint Online. So when we do gulp serve, that'll start the local workbench, and it'll make our web part. It deploys it locally and makes it available to add to a page so that we can kind of see it, play with it, and check it out. So we'll flip back over here and see if it's still running. It is still running. So while that's running, I'm going to switch over to one that I did earlier. I'll start up another command line. And I'll switch to my code directory. And I think I had one called just... Oh, there's the same. I gave it the same name. Hello world. Hello world. And now let's do a gulp serve in this one. If I could spell, there we go. Looks like I hit my caps lock key. That's not going to affect anything. So now I've gulped. I changed directory to this one I did earlier, and I've told it to go ahead and serve that up so I can play with it. So I've got doing a lot at once. I told it to serve this one up, and while that one's serving up, we've got this one still running. We'll see if I stress this machine out. But once this gulp serve starts running, we should see a window pop up that has the workbench running and gives me the capability to add the web part that I just created to a page to be displayed. Alright guys, so I waited a while and then I realized it is case sensitive. So typing gulp serve all in caps did not work. The gulp would have been okay, but the serve part needed to be in lowercase. So that's I'm glad that happened. That's a learning moment for everybody. Gulp serve case sensitive. Alright, so I did the gulp serve all lowercase. I don't know if you guys saw that. There we go. And now it's firing up that little local web server. There's my workbench, and now I've got a simulated SharePoint. Notice it's localhost 432, so it's not real SharePoint. I can't really do anything with it, but I can check out my web part. So I can click here, add, and look at that. There's just regular text web part, but then there's that hello world that I just added. So there's I didn't do any customization. I didn't change the welcome message or anything like that. But this is that custom templated hello world that I can add to this little workbench just to see what it looks like. And I could do things like what? Look at it in the mobile view. Microsoft, that's an old, they don't make those anymore. Tablet view, I can play around with that. I could add, different sections if I wanted to see my web part, what would my web part look like in a couple different sections. I can make this a little bit smaller. There we go. So now you can see in each section what it would look like. Add one here as well, just to get a feel. So yeah, the workbench gives you an idea to how do I play around with my web part. I can edit the different sections. I can mess around. I can delete things. Just to give you an idea of what it's like, mocking up your a little prototype of your web part. All right, let's go ahead and cancel the gulp serve. Done playing with that. A little Control C to stop that guy. Now my gulp serve should no longer be there. If I refresh this, it should say, oh, nope, server's not running. can't give you nothing. Take a few. There we go. Yep. I closed down my gulp serve, so that doesn't make sense anymore. All right. So we got the environment set up. We signed up for our dev client. Now, what I didn't show you, I've done, but I haven't showed you, is that in my in order to get this out there on my 365 developer tenant, I need to create an app catalog. SharePoint Framework uses the app catalog, which is used for add-ins, the old style way, not old style, but the previous style way of doing SharePoint extensions. So it builds on that. So we do need an app catalog, and then from there we can deploy the SharePoint web part as an app to make it available in our Office 365 tenant. So let's check that out. So we'll switch back over here, and there's an article on that. Which article are we at here? So we've done this part. Saw the workbench, played around with the different things. Now the next step, so we've done all that. The next step is connecting your SharePoint part to the web part to a list. I'm not going to go through these details. I'll leave that. We're running out of time. But this, if you walk through this step, it actually walks you through, hey, how do I access list data? It walks you through simulating list data using mocks. So there's some good information. It walks a little bit, it gives you a little bit of TypeScript code and using Visual Studio to edit that TypeScript code. Really good. I highly recommend that you walk through these steps and check them out because it gives you, real world functionality in your web part. So we're going to skip that for now due to time, but check those out. I want to go right to the deploy your web part. So we created our web part. Now I want to show you how to get it out there. And this is sort of a two-step process, because in this third Hello World Part 3, they talk about, all right, we've built it, we've done some connections. Now we want to get it out there to the real world, and they go through some ideas of what the JSON configuration file looks like. But then here they give you the final, what do we need? You got to package up. You got to say, hey, I need a SharePoint package file. And the SP package file is what we would use. I think of this in the older days when we had a WSP file, a web services solution file. This is the new, SP package file. Or in the app file, you had a .app file. This is the new way of doing it. You're looking for SP package file. So in order to get that, I've got to package my solution. So let me go and grab that, jump out to my solution that was being created. So this, let me go ahead and right, so my solution, my hello web part was created. Now I'm going to package that solution. Now if I hadn't, I wish I would have showed you the before, but this is going to result in a oh, look at all these error messages. That was not expected. Let's go see what's going on with that. Oh, you know why? I don't think I signed my self-cert. I skipped the self-cert on this one. That's okay. Let's go to the one where I did the self-cert. So here's the one that I did earlier. I did the step where I self-signed my certificate. So if I package this one, it should succeed. And it does. So now, if I look at what I have here, I should have a SharePoint directory, and let me bring that up in Explorer so it's a little easier to navigate. So we'll go here to C:/users, and what's me, and this is in my code file. So I went to Hello World Web Part, and now I have this guy that was just updated, and I have a solution directory, and now look at this. This is notice my time down here, 11:37, 11:37. This is my SharePoint package file that was just repackaged. That's what I'm going to use to deploy to Office 365. So if I come back up here to Office 365, remember this is the tenant we created earlier. What I didn't show you guys, one of the things I had to do was go to my admin, right, my apps for 365. So This is the app catalog I created. And how did I do that? I went to my admin console, the classic SharePoint admin console. I created a new site collection called the app catalog, and the instructions are all here in the article. But I created this app catalog, made sure I had site collection. I was one of the owners of this app catalog, and then in that app catalog, navigating to that's this guy. I uploaded the file, and I've done this there. This is one I did earlier, and this is a different one I did before, but let me do this one again. So I clicked on this guy, and I said, hey, I've got to go upload this file, and that's going to put a new version of my client. I'm going to say, yep, I want to go ahead and deploy that. Now, I did that really quick. Let me do that again. Notice the version that I just did. Where it's hosted. Oh, now it's not going to pop up. But it popped up and it said local host. So this is something to be aware of. It threw me for a loop the first time I did this. So now if I go out to my Office 365 and I try to add it to a page, so let's create a new page. Do a web part page and call this demo web part. And we'll just keep it simple. And this is not a modern page. This is the old school page. Now I'm going to add that new web part that I just uploaded. Should be under Other. There it is. I'm going to stop editing so we can see it. Notice we don't get anything. In fact, it's thinking about it, I think it's going to error out in a second here because it's hosted locally, right? I built it, I deployed it, but everything was still pointing at my local machine to host the client assets. So in order to get this to actually work, I got to come back to my command line and gulp serve that thing. So let's do that again, keeping it lowercase. So we'll let that gulp serve run. Then, it was briefly you saw an error message. Now it's already refreshed. Oh no, this is the local workbench. Let me go back to my error message. So this is what we saw earlier. I wasn't running gulp serve. I deployed this to Office 365. Notice it's madsharepoint.sharepoint.com. That's my Office 365. But it was using local resources. If I look at the details, you can see there it is, local host, local host. Now that I'm running gulp serve, if I refresh this, I should see it working, and I put working in quotes, but it's not. This is not going to work in the real world. This will only work on this machine where I have the gulp serve running. So how do we get this where I can use it anywhere? How do I really deploy this? And that's kind of what I said in my slides here. Let me jump back to my slides for a second. Right, so we did all that. We built our web part. We skipped the connection part. We kind of deployed, right? We packaged it. We deployed it to the app catalog. We made sure that we previewed it on the SharePoint page. You can even do it on a modern page. So I did it on a classic page, but you can do it on a modern page. But notice the error when I stopped gulp serve, right? So, or when gulp serve wasn't running. Now it works. If I stop gulp serve, again, F5, it's not going to work. Get that error message. So we want to, in order to really deploy it, this is a little explanation of what was going on. The SharePoint package is the deployment. That's what we uploaded, right? It's actually secretly a zip file. You could copy it, rename it to .zip, double click on it, see the components. It's got client-side assets in there. They're all XML files. It's got an app manifest. It's got config files. It gets deployed to the app catalog as an app. But part of those contents were pointing at the local host, and we need to fix that. So we need to prepare the web part assets to be not hosted locally, but hosted through Office 365. So let's do that. Let's go back to our article and see what the steps are for that. So that's the final step. it says host your web part from Office 365, content delivery network. We're going to skip. There's some PowerShell commands so that we can configure the web part to be from a global content delivery network. And I'm going to get right to the good stuff, which is where I just want, what are the commands so I can package it up and to be hosted from my own tenant. And they are, so we skip all that stuff. We really just need to bundle it and ready for shipment, and then we need to package it ready for shipment. These are the two commands where I say, okay, I no longer want it to run locally. I want it to be shareable in my tenant. So let's go ahead and grab these two commands. That one. Oh, not gulp serve, come on. So we want to bundle it ready for shipment. Let that think about it a second, and while that's doing it, I'm going to go grab the other one. Package it up for shipment. So here's the bundle running. Give that a second to run. It's bundling, it's bundling, it's bundling. And now we're going to package it up. And this should give us our final deployable web part that we can put on our tenant. I could send this in an email. Someone else could deploy it on their tenant. So again, if I go to my Explorer, you'll see, refresh this guy. There's our new package. And again, if you see here, I made a copy of one, right? So again, if I copy this, I can rename this to a .zip file if you want to see what's in there. I like to take things apart and see what's inside. There's that app manifest I talked about, and the client assets. These are all just XML files, and then any PNG files, JavaScript files that make up the deployment. So they're all packaged up in that, in this case, HW-SPPGKG file. So let's re-upload that to my Office 365 app catalog. So I'm back at the, well, I'm not at the catalog. Where's my catalog? There's my catalog. There's my site's app catalog. I'm going to upload the latest version, which has now been packaged for proper deployment. Now, see, it says, hey, this is going to run from SharePoint Online, not localhost. Yep, we like to deploy that. Now we should be able to go to some of our pages that were erroring before and refresh. And it should work without gulp serve running. Hey, there it is. So that's it in a nutshell. We set up our environment. We used a virtual machine in Azure. We installed all the tools. We built it. We deployed it locally. We ran the local workbench. And then we put it up. We did a few more commands to get it to run and host from Office 365. And then we deployed it to Office 365 where it's running all on its own. Now, there's lots more to this. You can do things like, obviously, add functionality. I skipped step 2 where it was reading data from a list. That's pretty important. But this, I want everyone to be able to have at least this one tool belt, one tool in your tool belt where you understand what the web part is. This is the web part, how to build one, what the steps are involved, what environment needs to, what you need in your environment, and then how to actually get it out there up and running. There's a lot of other stuff I didn't kind of touch on. The local workbench. So you go to any Office 365. And there's the layout / workbench if you want to work with a workbench on Office 365. So that's available to you. Just like the local workbench, you can do things like play around with your web part to see what it would look like in Office 365. So notice in the one that's hosted from Office 365, you get more than just the text web part. You get all, so you could really see what your web part looks like with some other really useful web parts. So I have to kind of look down here and see where mine is at. It's in here somewhere, I think. What did I call it? Hello World with an H? I don't even see it in here. Maybe this one. You know why? I don't think I deployed it to the root. So I'd have to go to my actual root site or one of the sites where I deployed it to. Like in this case, I got a UMD site where I actually deployed it. The other thing I didn't show you was showing a web part on a modern page. So here's a modern page that I created. And in this example, so you'll see it has the modern look and feel. But of course, it's going to work. You know, it was made to work on the modern page. The fact that it works on the classic page is pretty cool. But it also obviously works on the modern page. Alrighty. Lots of resources for you. So you want to learn more, you want to do more. MSSharePointDeveloper.com has been around forever. That's my favorite website. That's the one I easily rolls off my tongue. That's the one I go to first. But there's also developer.microsoft.com/SharePoint, developer.microsoft.com/Office, aka.ms SharePoint Practice. No, it's This is the best practices one, and then there's a community version of that too, where you can kind of ask questions and talk to other people in the community. These are all great links. I'll show you just this one real quick, MSSharePointDeveloper.com, because I think that one's really cool. And again, that one's been around forever, and they just keep updating it with the latest and greatest. MSSharePointDeveloper.com. A lot of these resources are overlap. MS Share. It would help if I type SharePoint. So, you know, don't be surprised if you go to this site and you see some videos, and then you go to one of the other sites and you see the same videos. But I like the way this one's laid out. So here you can see there's, you know, information on getting set up. There's a blog for the latest and greatest information from the team. There's issues that you can report or see what issues have been reported. There's videos, there's getting started. There's the link to the community. So you can see if I highlight our community, there's that SPPNP. There's samples. I love samples. I love, you know, I don't want to start from scratch. I like to start with, you know, some samples. So lots of great information. Check it out. Check out those other resources. I think there's a ton to learn, which is good and bad. But I think this is the future, moving to the cloud, and these are the things that we're going to have to become good at if we want to be successful going forward. So with that, let's wrap this guy up. Thank you. I appreciate it. Hopefully it made sense. If you're looking for a job, tinyU.com/DSA job. We got a bunch of jobs, a couple in Hawaii. If you want to go to Hawaii, check out my user group, Mad SharePoint. Come virtually attend one of our sessions. Find me on Twitter at David E. Patrick. If you have questions about this, I'm happy to take them. Thanks again. Take care, everyone. Hope you learned something.